Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. We're going to take a look at the road to the revolution. So again, in the previous chapter, we looked at a lot of the things that sort of set up what's going to happen. One of the big things being the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War, for a lot of historians, is the cause of the American Revolution. A lot of people begin looking at things after, but again, those after things don't happen without the French and Indian War happening. So the French and Indian War will change the relationship between England and its American colonies. And essentially what it's going to boil down to, right, is you have to ask yourselves, what was it more social, was it more economic, was it more political? And what you'll hopefully see is that the relationship changed because of economics. England was left in debt. Up to this point, England had no real reason to be heavily involved in what was happening with the colonies, right? And that's why we had first benign and then salutary neglect. The roots of the revolution, right? So again, there's this idea that Americans were very revolutionary since 1607. I mean, they had left, right? They wanted dramatic change. So what had happened, right? So distance is huge, right? So you are talking about being thousands of miles away from the motherland. For many people, it's not even the motherland, right? It's like their land is the colonies. So distance is going to play a huge role. Benign neglect is going to play a huge role, right? When you don't pay attention, like people are allowed to live their lives the way that they see fit, with the understanding, again, that they were still under British authority. And then salutary neglect, right? So again, even though the British began enacting navigation laws for the mercantilist system, they were loosely enforced, and that's going to be huge, right? So the colonists were allowed to essentially have what is called home rule, right? And again, in terms of the distance, right, it would take 6 to 8 weeks to travel across the Atlantic, and so, like I was saying, it's going to create this gap. So again, many people, by the time the American Revolution comes, they are going to begin looking at themselves as American and no longer British. Of the 13 colonies, Georgia was the only one that was formally of the 13 colonies, Georgia was the only one that was actually planted by the British government per se, being that like King George allowed James Oglethorpe, right, to establish it. But it was also because the British government had a use for it, right? It became this buffer colony. So the British had embraced the theory of mercantilism. So the theory of mercantilism is an economic system. So some of the things, and I will give you guys a chart in class so that you can have it. But the idea of mercantilism, right, with that a country's economic wealth could be measured by the amounts of gold and silver in the treasury. So you need to have money. So you are going to have colonies so that you can actually make more money, right? So you would be able to have more gold and silver. The country had to, in order to do this, the country had to export more than it was going to import. That makes sense, being that exporting means that you are selling, which means you're bringing in revenue, and importing means that you are buying, which means that you are actually giving revenue to another country. So the idea was that the colonies were going to supply, in this case, the mother country with the raw materials, okay? So the raw materials were going to come from the colonies, and they were going to go back to the motherland so that they could actually manufacture goods to be sold then back to the colonies themselves. So the raw materials, the wealth, meaning like the gold and silver, right, if possible, supplies, and the market. So they're also going to serve as the market. For example, right, the colonies grew tobacco and sugar for England. And so the Americans were essentially seen as renters. It's like the example that I mentioned in class to a few of you, right? If I work on a farm and I live on the farm, right, that belongs to somebody else, and I am growing apples for this owner, I then have to give the apples to the owner for those apples to then be sold back to me, even though I picked them. So here we have a chart that essentially shows like the theory of mercantilism, right? So on the one hand, you have over here, you have England, right, who wants gold, right? So again, they want to be able to have more gold and silver. So English establishes the colonies, in this case, America. America does not have gold, but can produce cotton, tobacco, and other things, right? England buys the cotton cheap and does not allow Americans to produce cloth, right? England sells finished cloth to Americans and to England's rival France. England gets gold and depletes France's gold reserves because France isn't able to do that, right? Because they're going to have to buy it, okay? So this is the way that mercantilism sort of works. So one of the things with mercantilism, right, is it severely handcuffed American trade. So again, they had to follow the navigation laws. So the navigation laws were first enacted in the 1650s, so that the colonists would actually follow through on their part of the mercantilist system. Okay. So it kept Americans sort of in an infantile state, right? So like they were not allowed to grow up economically to be self-sufficient. Parliament had passed the navigation laws again, like I said, to enforce mercantilism. An example of a navigation law was that the colonists could only transport stuff using British ships, because if they used other countries' ships, they'd have to pay that country, which again would put more gold and silver in that country's reserves. Americans also could only export and import through England. So if they needed to export to another country, they couldn't. All the exports would actually go, or the raw materials or anything like that, would actually go to England, and then again, like I said, be manufactured, right? So they couldn't trade directly with another country. Americans also had tariffs. So the Parliament had passed tariffs. So again, if they produced something like cotton, and then the cotton was sent to England so that they could make textiles, those textiles were then sent back to the colonists, but there was an import tax. So an import tax is a tax that is placed on imported goods. So an example would be, let's say Honda. So when Honda sells its cars, Honda being a Japanese company, when it sells its cars to the United States government charges this Japanese company to sell their product in the United States. So the government makes money, but Honda's not going to lose money. And so what they do is when you go buy the car, they embed the price. And so what happens is, let's say that the American government charged them $1,000 to sell their car here. Honda is then going to raise the price of their car by $1,000 so that Honda doesn't lose out on that $1,000. So what this means is that an import tax is an embedded tax, right? So a lot of times consumers don't get upset because they don't see the tax being added on. So the colonists were also restricted in what they could manufacture, right? And that's going to play a very vital role. The colonists had to use gold and silver, right, as payment, and that's going to be really important too. One of the things we're going to talk about is like the Currency Act. The colonial laws could be voided by a Privy Council, which also meant that like within the colonies, if the colonists made laws that England saw that were not fit to benefit the mercantile system or England itself, royal governors within the colonies could actually overrule any legislation that the colonists passed for themselves. So again, you can see here, right, navigation laws, right, navigation acts begin to be passed in 1650, 1660, things like lumber, iron, cotton, all right, lumber would be made into furniture to be sold back to the colonists, iron would be then turned into tools to be sold back, and then things like cotton, right, would be sold right back. Other things were things like sugar, tobacco, and indigo. So until 1763, the navigation laws were rarely enforced, right? Things like benign and salutary neglect made sure of that. One of the people that made the most money off of this was John Hancock. He amassed a fortune because of benign and salutary neglect, because he continued to smuggle in Massachusetts. And that's going to play a really important role too, because eventually what's going to happen, right, is a lot of illegal searches and seizures are going to happen. Tobacco planters had guaranteed market though, right? So there were benefits to the mercantile system. If you're a tobacco farmer in Virginia, you have a guaranteed place to sell your tobacco in England. So there was merits to it. There was some self-government, right? The colonists still were being allowed some home rule. Americans had Midas military for free, right? The colonists didn't have to have an army or a navy because the British military was their military. France and Spain enforced mercantilism more than the English actually did. And so the colonists, there's this question of whether or not they deserved to complain as much as they did. So picture of John Hancock, right? Again, he's very famous because of the signing of the Declaration. So enforcement of the mercantilist and navigation law post-1763 was fused for the American Revolution. So the question then is, why after 1763 did the British begin enforcing these things a lot more? And so one of the things that ends up happening, right, is because of the debt that is created through the French and Indian War, England is going to have to recuperate some of that debt, and so the mercantile system will come into play. So some of the disadvantages, right? Americans could not buy, sell, ship, or manufacture under the most favorable condition. The South, which produced crops that weren't grown in England, was preferred over the North, and so there's a little bit of preference shown towards the South, right? Tobacco growers were at the mercy of English prices, and the colonists felt that Great Britain was milking milking the colonists, right, of all of their resources. Okay, one of the things that was done immediately to try to raise revenue was the stamp tax. So the French and Indian War had created massive debt, right? So Parliament had ruled that the Americans would pay 1/3 of that debt. So a third. That meant that 2/3 of the debt was actually going to be paid by the English. Prime Minister George Grenville ordered the navigation laws. So this guy is really important, right? So the new Prime Minister at the end of the French and Indian War, he ordered that the navigation laws be enforced, which is going to cause some resentment, right? Because they had been loosely enforced up to that point. So one of the things that happened is Parliament, a year after the French and Indian War ends, they ratified the 1764 Sugar Act. And all it basically did was increase the tariff on foreign sugar imported from the West Indies. In order to make sure that the colonists actually went through with this, was that they actually passed a quartering act that required the colonists actually house the British troops who were going to keep an eye on them. The thing with the Sugar Act is that it was an import tax, like I was saying, and so therefore the colonists did not necessarily see the price of the sugar rising because the tax was already embedded, and so that's not going to get them as mad. Okay, and again, this is a picture of George Grenville. Still the Sugar Act, and so what was the Sugar Act, right, is a huge question. So here we have the Quartering Act. Okay, so like I was saying, the Quartering Act is going to be about housing the British troops, and we'll talk a little bit about that in class. Okay. And so the Stamp Act, right? So the Stamp Act was passed in 1765. And so it was passed to raise money for the new military force that's there. So the act mandated the use of stamped paper. So the colonists had no choice but to use paper that had the royal seal. So imagine going to, say, the Gap, and you get a receipt for your purchase, and then the employee then says, okay, I need to stamp the receipt with something that says the Gap. And you're like, okay, well, that's going to make it official. But then now you have to pay for that stamp. And you're like, well, wait a minute. No, I don't need the stamp. Well, no, you do because it's not official. And you won't be able to return any of the clothes without this official stamp. So now you're having to pay more, right? So this is a direct tax versus an indirect tax. And so this is actually going to make the colonists really upset. So things like, some of the things that were like actually had these things were like marriage certificate, death certificate, right? Even like playing cards had to have this, and so it was a way for the English Parliament to make money off the colonists. So here's a picture of the stamp itself on the right, and then the actual decree from Parliament and King George III. So the colonists felt that they were unfairly taxed for an unnecessary army. Like, why is the army still here, right? So a Stamp Act Congress was formed by some of the colonists, and one of the things that they said was that they were going to boycott British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. So one of the things that they shouted was the infamous no taxation without representation. No Americans were actually seated in Parliament, and so the colonists said that this was not fair. Great Britain responded and said, well, no, you are being represented through something called virtual representation. And the idea was that every member of Parliament represented every British subject, even though there were no members of the colonies in Parliament itself. So here's just a picture, right? No taxation without representation. So in 1765, representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York to discuss the stamp tax. What they decided was that and one of the things you should think about, right, is 9 out of the 13. It's kind of a step in the direction of colonial unity. They agreed that they would boycott British goods and that they would actually start manufacturing their own goods. So one of the things that was also formed was something called the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty were kind of these colonial thugs, if you may, that were created by Samuel Adams. And the idea was that they were going to ensure that the colonists were going to boycott British goods. So they wanted to ensure, right, through force, that the colonists were going to go through with their promise. So one of the other things that they would do is they were going to storm the houses of tax officials and threaten to tar and feather those that did not obey the non-importation agreement or the boycott. Now, what started happening as a result was that the British merchants who were making the goods that were being boycotted, their pockets started getting hurt. So they actually went to Parliament and were like, look, you need to repeal this Stamp Act because it's hurting our pockets. And so as a result, in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Okay, Sons and Daughters of Liberty, right? Just some pictures. Okay, one of the things that also happened, okay, as a result of the repeal of the Stamp Act is something called the Declaratory Act was passed. And what the Declaratory Act did was it basically said, it was a reminder to the colonists that Great Britain is in charge and they could pass other things and therefore enforce those other things. Some of those other things, and one of the things that happens is that in 1767, the Chancellor of the Treasuries, or it's kind of like the Secretary of the Treasury, a guy by the name of Charles Townshend, he comes up with a really brilliant plan to raise money. And he figured out that the colonists did not get upset, about the Sugar Act, but instead got upset about the Stamp Act because it was a direct tax. So he figured if they passed more indirect taxes, the colonists wouldn't be as upset. So one of the things that they did is they passed these indirect taxes. They started taxing things like lead, paper, paint, and tea. And the idea, like I said, was that the colonists wouldn't notice the tariffs and would not get as mad. The problem is that they began to see the price of the tea. So the colonists continued to disobey British law, and smuggling continued. So Parliament began to send more and more troops. So in March of 1770, some of the Bostonians, some of the people began to harass the British Redcoats. And as a result of this harassment, a massacre takes place, right? A quote-unquote massacre. So the Boston Massacre occurs on March 5th, 1770. And essentially what happens is a few colonists unfortunately die. And Paul Revere, right, who we of course think about because of his ride, who was actually an engraver, actually took what happened and he turned it into some of the first propaganda in the colonies. And they printed this pamphlet, and in this pamphlet he called it the Massacre. And the pamphlet was distributed throughout the 13 colonies so that they could see, right, the power of England and what they were willing to do. So as a result of all this, one of the things that the colonists started doing was they started something called the Committees of Correspondence began to happen. At first, they started in Boston, where some of the Bostonians were writing letters to each other about what was happening. Samuel Adams was the person who kind of led this to happen. And so one of the things that they would do is through this letter writing, they spread propaganda. Eventually, this letter writing went beyond Boston and it went through all Massachusetts, and it actually spread to all 13 colonies, where leaders of the colonies began to actually correspond with one another. Eventually, the Committees of Correspondence become the First Continental Congress, because what's going to make more sense is instead of waiting for all of these letters to be exchanged, what actually made more sense was for them to meet and actually discuss some of the things that were happening. So in 1773, the powerful British East India Company was overburdened with 17 million pounds of unsold tea. So Parliament decided to pass the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly over selling of tea to the colonists. So because of the township duties, the colonists had agreed that they were going to boycott tea because they were not going to pay the unfair prices. So England had an idea that, hey, if we give the British East India Company this monopoly, not only does it help the British East India Company, but it also ensures that the boycott is broken. And so one of the things that they did, like I said, was they gave the monopoly to the British East India Company, and they were now going to sell their product. So the Sons and Daughters of Liberty have this idea that, you know what, we cannot allow the tea to be sold, right? And so again, through the Committees of Correspondence, they began writing to members of the colonists throughout, saying, look, do not allow the tea to be sold. The most famous of these tea parties, of course, occurred on December 16th, 1773, in Boston, right, where they dumped 342 tea chests into Boston Harbor. Now, of course, that's not going to make the British happy, so again, here's a picture, right, Boston Tea Party. We're going to party like it's 1773. So as a result of this, the Parliament passed what were called the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they were called the Intolerable Acts. Same things. So 1774, Parliament passed these repressive acts to punish the colonies for what had happened. So one of these was the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston Harbor until all the money for the tea was paid for. They also didn't allow Massachusetts from having town hall meetings anymore. And the Massachusetts Charter was revoked. The worst of the coercive acts was probably the Quebec Act, which basically gave the people of Quebec home rule, even though they were French Catholics. And so the colonists in Massachusetts are going to be really upset about that, because for a long time they were claiming that they wanted home rule and they wanted to be respected, and now they're being disrespected. So, as a result, the First Continental Congress was held between September and October of 1774. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. 12 of the 13 colonies met. Georgia did not send any representatives. One of the things that they did is they wrote the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and basically telling the king that, look, these are our grievances against you. It's not the Declaration of Independence. And King George III essentially just tore it up. They also agreed that they were going to stockpile weapons and form militias, right? These militias are going to be the Minutemen. They agreed to meet again in 1775. As a result of this, one of the things that we also begin to see is patriots and loyalists. And so within the colonists, you had people that were still very loyal to the British Crown. And so they had told members of the British military within the colonies that the colonists were actually stockpiling weapons. So in April of 1775, loyalists had informed the British in Boston of the existence of these supplies, and traders, people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. So Samuel Prescott, Paul Revere, and William Dawes all set off to warn the people of the surrounding areas that the redcoats were coming. And they were coming to arrest people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock and to destroy the supplies. So 700 British soldiers marched to Concord outside of Boston. 80 Minutemen were meeting them at Lexington. And so we don't know who shot first, whether it was the colonists or the British. But what happened was shots were fired, and 8 colonists were killed, and 1 British soldier was injured. The British soldiers continued on to Concord, and they were able to destroy the weapons. They were not able to find Paul Revere or John Hancock or Samuel Adams. And so what they did is they turned back around after they did that and marched back to Boston. But this time, back at Lexington, 400 Minutemen were waiting for them, and they killed over 100 redcoats. So you can see here just a map of Lexington and Concord. Okay. One of the things that we'll take a look at with Chapter 8 are some of the things that happened afterward, but it's important that we look at going forward, right, with the first shots being fired, some of the imperial strengths and weaknesses, right? So, for example, England had 7.5 million people to America's 2 million. They had a navy, the Americans didn't. They had great wealth, and the Americans didn't necessarily have the same amount of wealth. They were also able to hire mercenaries. In this case, they actually hired 30,000 Germans or Hessians from the state of Hesse in Germany, an army of 50,000, and they had 50,000 loyalists living within the colonies. Britain continued to deal with Ireland, which is going to be a weakness, right? They're still having to deal with the Catholics in Ireland. France was kind of lurking in the background, right, trying to get revenge for the French and Indian War. The English Whigs within Parliament actually supported the American cause because they wanted to actually take control or power away from the king. They were their generals were very overconfident. The military was 3,000 miles away from home. They did not know the American landscape, and they had no central government to capture because the central government was back in England. With that being said, right, the American strengths were great leadership. People like George Washington and Ben Franklin. They eventually will have French aid, and they will have a great French leader within them, a guy by the name of the Marquis de Lafayette. They are going to have to fight a defensive war. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. They are going to fight guerrilla warfare, and they have a moral advantage. They have a cause. And then, of course, the weaknesses is that they lack unity. There's a little bit of sectional jealousy between North, Middle, and South. There's no capital, as in no money, right? Because their money was coming from England. So they're going to rely on some of the wealthier people to actually donate to the cause. There's no navy. 1/5 of the country is loyalist, 1/5 is patriot, and 3/5 is the average Joe. So the question is going to be, how do we convince the average Joe to fight this war?